Ray Osman from ROM Ancient Cultures, and I'm here today with Kate Cooper, who is Rebank's Research Fellow at the ROM, and also Kenneth Lopatin from the J. Paul Getty Museum. And we're going to talk about an ivory figurine that's been in the ROM's collection for quite some time and has been described at one point as a Minoan goddess. And to start off, right off the bat, we have a question. So I want to remind everyone that we have the question and answer function is on in Google+, so you can send us questions that way. And you can also tweet us questions at #AskROM. So Kate, the first question I'm going to pose to you comes from a viewer. What prompted you to question the authenticity of this object, especially since it had been so long in the collection?
Well, thanks. That's a brilliant question to start us off, because that's really what we want to talk about today. So just a quick recap. We bought the object, the ROM bought the object in 1931 off a dealer stroke Cambridge professor, so somebody who was reputable but was just a dealer. And basically, for 70 years, we didn't doubt the authenticity much. The piece had been authenticated by Sir Arthur Evans, and Sir Arthur Evans was God as far as the Minoans go, because he was the person who brought them back rediscovered them. His excavation to the Palace of Knossos, which began at the beginning of the 20th century, were what brought the Minoan civilization to light. So he was the expert at the time, and in 1931 he loved our object. I just want to show you her as she is right now, which is slightly undressed, but so that everybody knows what we're talking about. Here we have the ROM's goddess. Sorry, camera. There's the camera. Excellent. She has been undressed slightly, but she came to the museum basically in about that kind of condition. She has arms on, but this is her. And she has that unusual costume. And I'm going to see if I can screen share to show you what her costume looks like, because this is kind of key to why she was, well, her whole identity, and why Evans got quite so excited about her. So let me see, does this work? Start screen share. No, this hasn't worked, sorry.
No, yeah, no, we could see her.
Is that her?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
So what you're seeing is Evans's publication of our goddess, and he believed that her unusual costume, which is this kind of loincloth stroke corset piece, which is actually a male costume. I mean, we see the loincloth in male acrobats and male worshippers, but combined with the well, obvious female features of our piece, he basically thought that this was proof of his pet theory, which he'd held for quite a long time, that she was a female bull leaper. Now we have, he had evidence from his excavations of male bull leapers that had been, well, there's gems and frescoes of male bull leapers. So he knew that bull leaping happened, but what he thought he could detect in some of this evidence that it wasn't just men who were taking part, but women too. What image do you have on the screen now? Do you have
the fresco?
You have the fresco, excellent. So the fresco shows a youth leaping over the bull, and the youth, we can tell, has the brown skin, so male, wearing this codpiece. And then either side you've got white-skinned figures, which Evans interpreted as being female bull leapers. White skin was, in Egyptian art, a way of signifying female as opposed to male. So he thought we had a female bull leaper here. And not just that, we had the goddess of the female bull leaper. So he was very excited. And the ROM was very excited because it was a valuable piece, beautifully carved, made of precious materials, and from this fairly newly discovered civilization. And other museums were competing to buy similar pieces. Evans and others compared our piece to some other ivory figurines decorated with gold, both pieces that have been discovered in excavations and also pieces that were bought by other museums that didn't have an excavation context. So that was the state of play. We liked it, and for 70 years it was a ROM icon. How can I get this off? So ROM icon on display for 70 years, and it basically wasn't until Ken, our guest today, managed to, well, change people's minds by showing us that there was more to this story than we had thought. She wasn't just, well, she certainly wasn't uncontroversially a Minoan figurine. In fact, she was related to these other pieces that he went on to investigate. But it wasn't until the, well, early 2000s when he published an article and later his book, which is what I hope we will be talking about today. Here we have the book. And it wasn't until then that the ROM actually started to really change its mind about the authenticity. So it's led me, we had her on display with Ken's material for a while, and then she was taken off display. And it hasn't really been until now that we've been able to re-examine her, to really have a look at what she is showing and what we can tell about her, because until now, Ken's has been the last word on it. And so I would like to firstly say that a lot of this information is already on the blog, the ROM blog of the project, but it is indebted to Ken's work. And so we're really lucky to have him today to talk to us about his investigation. And with that, I think I would like to hand over to Ken to talk about what he discovered in his investigation. So, Ken, over to you. Has that worked?
Well, thanks, Kate. And first of all, I want to thank you and the ROM not only for inviting me to participate in today's program, but especially for really reopening the question of the ROM figurine. It's quite wonderful when museums are willing to open their files, open their labs, put resources into questioning objects that, whether long time accepted as genuine or iconic or not, you know, are problem pieces. All too often they get shunted to the basement, or you know, the walls come up and there's a protective save the object and the reputation of the museum at any cost. And I think it's really wonderful that in the pursuit of knowledge, you're really looking at this, you're looking at this afresh, from scratch, and bringing important resources to bear. When I was doing my work in the 80s and 90s, published then in the early 2000s, I had a lot of cooperation, but there was understandably resistance. I seemed to be an outsider coming to attack, and I wasn't on the attack, but I was trying to learn more. And as I worked with different museums, there were different levels of cooperation. And I just want to say, I think it's wonderful, you know, to be looking at these things. My knowledge of the ROM statuette, which Arthur Evans called Our Lady of the Sports, he envisioned as the Minoan mother goddess, as patroness of the bull leaping arena, came from Evans when he published it in 1931. And my interest in the ROM figure and the other Minoan figures really grew out of my research as a graduate student in archaeology, and I was looking at the famous gold and ivory statues, the chryselephantine. This is a fancy Greek word for meaning gold and ivory statues that were the most important in ancient Greece. The statue of Athena that stood inside the Parthenon on the Athenian Acropolis. The statue of Zeus at Olympia from the 5th century BC, from the golden age of Greece. It was one of the 7 wonders of the world. This was my research project, and these statues, these great monumental images, the most famous statues from the Greek and Roman world are lost to us. We have descriptions of them in ancient authors. We have images of them on coins, on pots, in small statuettes. So I was doing research trying to gather all the evidences I could, and I came across a group of much earlier, or purported to be much earlier, Minoan Bronze Age statuettes that were meant to be a millennium earlier, not from the 400s BC, but from the 1400s BC, from the Minoan civilization at Crete. Pieces that Arthur Evans, as Kate said, excavated at Knossos in 1901, and then other pieces bought by museums eager to share in the discoveries of Evans in the early part of the century. The most famous, perhaps, is the Boston Goddess, and I don't know if you can throw that up on the screen, Kate, which was acquired, again, to great fanfare by the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 1914. And after I finished my doctorate, I was teaching in Boston, so I was very interested in the Boston statue. And there were several others in Baltimore. Evans himself possessed two, one now in Oxford, one now in Seattle. And there were also statues of the similar type in stone, which obviously weren't as valuable as the gold and ivory ones. So this brought me to the Toronto statue as one of the group. And as I started looking at them, I started having questions about their technique, about their style, about their material, and especially about their history, the stories woven around them. And as I dug deeper and deeper, I became aware that there were forgers working with, not with Evans. Evans was unaware at first of this. There were members of Evans' staff, his conservators, also seemed to have been producing forgeries on the side. And they had privileged access, and they were able to make works that convinced him. And so initially, my research focused on, are these objects that don't come from excavations, are they genuine or not? And I wasn't the first to question these figures, but because Evans was such a strong authority, those who questioned them early were really shouted down by his belief.
Yeah.
So it was really by lining up this material, the excavated material that Evans knew, the material excavated after Evans, and the unexcavated material, and looking at what were the features of genuine figurines and what were the features that were anomalous in the unexcavated material, that led me to believe that a whole class of statuettes were really produced to satisfy the desires of an eager market. And the Rom figurine seemed to be, in many ways, I think, the most fascinating of these figures because of some of the features that Kate talked about, this combination of male and female, and how that occurred and why the statue has captured so much of the imagination. So my belief is not that the story ends if we decide that these figures are not ancient. The story almost begins there because we learn not so much about the ancient world, but we learn about the modern world and how we reconstruct the past.
So presumably...
I'll turn it back to you, Kate, there.
Sorry, thank you. It's hard to have a conversation because for some reason our voice recognition doesn't seem to be quite responding. So it's probably my fault for doing screen shares. Anyway, so one of the questions I have for you, I suppose I would like to talk a little bit more in detail about the Boston Goddess, which was one of the pieces that you really were focusing on, and certainly I think you've proved your case that this was actually a piece that was manufactured in the early 20th century to match the expectations of the market and to cater for the huge number of people who now wanted to own a bit of Minoan past. So I'd like to just go through some details of that piece and compare it a bit with the Rom figurine to just try and see where are similarities that you've brought up in in general terms, a few more of the specifics of the similarities and indeed the differences between these two pieces and what it might say about its authenticity. So if I were to put up the image of the Boston goddess when she first came into the museum, would you be able to just talk us through a little bit about the construction, the sort of technical side, which, as you've mentioned, is one of the things that you see to be suspicious about the figurines that don't have an excavation context? Would that be something I can do? I don't know. Let me see. So, first we have the Boston goddess itself as it appears in the museum now. As you can see, she's holding snakes in her hands. And then, if I can work this, I'll give her a picture of her as she came into the museum. No?
There she is.
Yep. Oh, sorry. There she was.
So the Boston goddess, there she was, if you can get her back.
I'll get her back.
The Boston goddess was the first of the figurines to appear outside of Crete. And she came to the Boston goddess in 1914, and the stories of her arrival are colorful, complicated, contradictory, and in the end, untrue. And this kind of historical, modern historical information is one of the factors. And I think it's important to emphasize that generally, although we're used to watching CSI on television and identify one feature as the smoking gun where science tells us this is true or this is false, this person is guilty, this person is innocent, things are usually much more complicated, and we've got to bring to bear on this material a variety of evidence: technical, stylistic, historical, material, scientific. And the Boston goddess, as you see, was made of many components, and this corresponded to how the ancient material that was excavated by Evans and found after Evans's excavations were made. Figurines weren't carved like medieval statues from one big tusk and then had bits added. The material, ivory, wasn't found naturally on Crete. It came from North Africa, Egypt, the ancient Near East. It was very valuable, and the pieces were prized. And so components were carved: heads, arms, legs, and they would be joined to wooden cores and be gilded. The ivory was used for the flesh bits, and the other bits were hidden. And this was a feature of the genuine material, which Evans conservators had access to. The Boston goddess is comprised of numerous components, but the joining systems, there's the genuine material. You see the reconstructed figure, complete in upper left, and some of the heads. And you can see on the lower part of the page, lower right, one of the heads that had drilled holes and gilt bronze hair that's now very corroded. You can see the figure, the head below, has deep-set skull-like eyes for inlays, whereas the head above has incised eyebrows and incised eyes and this nice smile. So even in the genuine material, there are some differences in style and technique, inlaid eyes versus not inlaid eyes. There are different kinds of joins used. Sometimes their tenons are round, sometimes they're rectangular. The Boston goddess is in many ways closest to the excavated material, but its joining systems are somewhat different. It has a socket tenon join. This is very technical stuff, but I think it's important. It's, again, one factor. It also, the way the head and the body are carved together is unlike any of the excavated material. The join in the center of the body is very strange and doesn't correspond to the dress. there are also problems with the way the gold is misunderstanding the dress. So although it was convincing to Evans and others in the early part of the 20th century when it was acquired, a lot of material excavated after it has different techniques of construction and different style. So these raised red flags, and in addition to the historical narrative that I mentioned, where it was said to have been found by archaeologists at Knossos, which we know isn't true. It was meant to be carried by an archaeologist on a ship that sailed from Athens to Boston in 1914. No ship sailed. These things both undermined the standard narrative and suggest an alternate narrative that it was produced by forgers. So the Boston Goddess, which became the linchpin to the identification of subsequent statues as genuine, like the Rome one, when that falls, that casts serious doubt on the others.
Yes,
Kate.
Thank you. Yes, I agree completely. I suppose one of my issues is that what you're talking about with the Boston Goddess, we see replicated in, for instance, the Baltimore Goddess, which is, although in a different state of preservation, has a similar history and a similar technique and a similar appearance. And in some ways, our piece also has that. One thing that I am quite surprised by is that our piece doesn't have this excavation history that's been made up for it. It was said to come from an old Cretan family collection, and nobody's ever bothered to try and say, oh, but it was dug up next to the Palace of Knossos kind of thing, which seems to be a slight difference between some of the other pieces and our own. I realise that we are completely getting out of time here because we only have about 5 minutes left. So I wonder whether I could just ask you the question. It's probably a very big question, but what of these pieces that don't have an excavation context, what would you like to see to rehabilitate them? Is there any way that something that we discover or that future archaeologists discover, is there anything that they could discover that would change your view of any of these pieces? Not just not necessarily the Boston piece itself, but any of this little family of suspect pieces. Ken? Or is that too big a question for 5 minutes?
Well, I think for the Rome Goddess, it's very difficult because I think we know enough. And where we can learn more, for example, is many of the ivories excavated after Evans turned out to be hippopotamus ivory, not elephant ivory. The forgers don't seem to have known this. Mm-hmm. If the Rome ivory turned out to be hippopotamus and not elephant, that would be a check in the good column for it. That wouldn't prove that it's ancient, but would gain support. But I believe it's been demonstrated it's elephant and not hippo. If we tested the Rome ivory through carbon-14, this is difficult because it's been treated and restored, and getting a clean sample is very difficult. But even if we did a test and we were convinced the test was accurate and the Rome ivory dated to the late Bronze Age, to 1500, so that the forgers had access to excavated material and could reuse material. The scientific test will date the materials, but not the workmanship. Also, it would be interesting to have some analysis of the gold and to know if the gold had the same elemental composition with copper and some silver that Minoan gold did and didn't have any modern elements. That would be helpful, but that wouldn't prove that it was ancient. It would just prove that it was consistent with antiquity. Whether we could say the forgers reworked ancient gold or were just lucky in their composition. So I think in the case of the Ram goddess, because of its relation to Evans's ideas about female bull leapers, I think this was a statue that was really made to satisfy Evans. There's not anything like it amongst the ancient material. And art in antiquity wasn't really called art. And originality wasn't a virtue. It was meant to convey meanings to people. And so we don't see unique things. We have representations of...
I think we've lost you there slightly. Is it just me? I can't hear. Sorry, Ken. I think we've actually lost the sound for you at the moment. So yes, I mean, obviously she is extremely suspicious, and especially because of her costume. One of the things that you were mentioning was the scientific dating and carbon-14 dating. And this is something that we are looking into to a certain extent, but science really does not have the answer, I'm afraid. As I'm going to be explaining in some future blog posts, we have very limited ability for doing scientific testing on this, partly because of the contaminants, but partly because of the state of the ivory itself. So yes, scientific dating does not have the answer, and stylistic dating does certainly associate her with a lot of suspicions. And I suppose what I would be liking to do is retelling her story again, because obviously one of the things that is so interesting about her, if she is a fake, as with the rest of them, if they are fakes, as you have said before, what makes this really interesting is that they are a product of their time. They're telling us about reception of the Minoans and how they were viewed and how important they were at this early 20th century, well, the first few decades of the 20th century, just after they've been discovered. And one of the things that makes this so interesting for us is that although often pieces that are thought to be suspect are actually, once they have been discounted and said that they are fake, they are not genuine of whatever time period they're expected to be, they are dismissed. What we have here is something that will still tell a story, partly because if it is a modern creation, we know the circumstances in which it was created, and we know roughly when it was created, and so we still have a context. Even if it isn't the original context, it's still able to tell us a lot of information, as with this whole family that we are discussing. I'm afraid we seem to have lost Ken completely now. He's come back. Or not. But we are getting very close to the end of our time, so I wonder whether, Ray, now is a good time to wrap up.
Sure. So I thought I would just remind everyone that you can follow the full story of Kate's research together with Julia Fenn, our conservator here at the ROM.
Sorry, can I just interject?
On the ROM website. Sure.
As well as following my blog post story of our goddess, please do, I would encourage you, go out and find Ken's book, because this really does give us a lot of the story in far more detail than we've been able to cover it in this very brief presentation. But here is the book, Mysteries of the Snake Goddess. You can buy it in bookstores, certainly on Amazon. I'm not sure which other bookstores have it in stock at the moment, but go and find it, because it's a fascinating read, and it really helps to shed light on all the suspect pieces and the reasons that we are suspecting them. I will be feeding off this and discussing some of the details with our particular goddess in more detail in subsequent blog posts. Sorry Sorry to interrupt, Ray. Back to you.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank both of you, Kate Cooper and Ken LaPatin, for joining us today to talk about the ROM's goddess, Minoan or not. We have her here in our collection. Our next Google Plus Hangout will be on March 12th. It'll be at 1 p.m. and we'll be joined by Dr. Chen Shen and a couple other members of our exhibition team here at the ROM, and we'll be talking about the process of creating a major exhibition and focusing especially on our Forbidden City exhibition, which opens on March 8th. So thank you very much to both of you, and thanks everyone for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.